Welcome to our second webinar in this series on Indigenous Data Sovereignty. My name's Jeff Hackett from Shared Value Solutions, and I have the honor of kind of shepherding this kind of interesting webinar series along and bringing in some amazing people, some great folks who are specialists on all types of Indigenous data sovereignties, all the different facets and elements of it, to help bring this needed and amazing knowledge to the communities at large here in terms of all the different spaces, from working with the tech space all the way nonprofits, government, and Indigenous nations and organizations. So the topic today we're looking at is demystifying data sovereignty tools and technologies. So what we were thinking about when creating this was like, how do we create a critical discourse over that kind of intersection between Indigenous nations, Indigenous data, and technology within like this ever-evolving digital landscape, and obviously all these things on people's mind mostly these days is AI and machine learning. The landscape is evolving at an ever quicker pace. So, where does data sovereignty fit into this realm? So I'm really thrilled to be joined by an amazing group of folks here, distinguished panel of experts who are going to share their insights and experience from the field from very different perspectives. So over the next hour, we're going to explore how technology can both, aim to empower, but it also can marginalize Indigenous peoples. So that's an important consideration that we need to emphasize in terms of that technology is responsive and appropriate to Indigenous needs and priorities and aspirations. So when we are looking at community-led solutions, that we're ensure that we're creating an inclusive and respectful environment so that technology can be that kind of catalyst to support Indigenous self-determination, cultural preservation, and decision-making. So I'm just going to do a land acknowledgement to start off with. So, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I want to acknowledge that I'm in Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, as its colonial name is. So I'm working here on stolen, unceded ancestral lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka, so the Mohawk Nation. So this land is a gathering place for many First Nations, and I recognize that Kanien'kehá:ka is the custodians of the land and water, and which I have the privilege of living on today. And these lands that they've lived on since time immemorial are subjected to the ongoing disruption and caused by settler colonial genocide. So just a reminder to everyone that, might be new to the space, that colonialism is not over, it's ongoing. So as a 7th generation Irish settler who was born and raised in Montreal, so I want to acknowledge that I have a lot of privilege to be living here, working here on these stolen lands. So my capacity to be here would not be possible without this ongoing violence and extraction of settler colonialism. So what we really need to do is work better and in a variety of different ways to undo and confront white supremacy, Indigenous exposition, and displacement. So as a starting point, I really want to emphasize that we need to seek opportunities to support land back, to listen and respect to Indigenous voices, uplift knowledge keepers and Indigenous ways of knowing, and importantly, especially as a white male, use our privilege to amplify the efforts of our Indigenous neighbors. And with that said, that's kind of why I'm here, is that I'm definitely trying to use my privilege in the space to bring all these amazing folks here that are doing all this amazing work on the land, working with community and supporting community in a variety of ways. So once again, as a reminder for those who haven't, everyone take a moment to look at native land. So it's native-land.ca. Take a look and understand that you're on, stolen and unceded territory, and reflect on that and how can we do better in working and being, neighbors with communities. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists here. So we have Natiea Vinson, as a member of Te Kamloops Tase Webcom. that close. Like, first, I'm always nervous when I say it, so it's good. So apologies if I botched it. The CEO of the First Nations Technology Council. So Natiea has more of a decade of experience working as an entrepreneur and across academia, social enterprise organizations, and the public and private sectors. She holds a Master's of Business Administration from Simon Fraser University and a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Concordia University. So at some point, Natiea and I probably cross paths and drink coffee in the same shop, which is great. We have James Delorme, the Indigenous digital and social disruptor with the guiding principles of Indigenous knowledge and the foundations of cultural safety and humility. James uses his leadership skills to serve First Nation communities, government, and the private sector with economic and social projects alike. As a former chief of Klaus First Nation, he's had the privilege of heralding technology, ecotourism, green energy, aquaculture, and forestry projects, serving the social and economic needs of Klaus. In his current role as the president of technology and research company, IndigiLink, he remains steadfast, working on passion projects with internet connectivity, data governance, and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, blockchain, self-sovereign identity, and IM and IT projects. James is passionate about bringing the digital divide bridging the digital divide for First Nations and Indigenous communities, and continues to promote cultural safety and Indigenous humility to technology companies around the globe. And finally, we have Alejandro Mayoral Baños, is a dedicated activist and academic with passion for bridging the worlds of Indigenous peoples and digital technologies. Through a holistic approach that encompasses community engagement, research, software development, and education, Alejandro actively contributes to a more inclusive and equitable digital tech landscape. So he's the executive director and founder of the Indigenous Friends Association in Canada, which everyone should go look. It's such a really cool organization that does some really neat stuff for you, Indigenous youth. And president of the Natiea in Mexico. He works diligently to promote tech equity, digital sovereignty, and sustainable career pathways for Indigenous communities. Beyond his primary role, Alejandro has an extensive background of volunteering, leading, collaborating, and participating in various projects centered on indigeneity and social action. His work has spanned countries like Canada, Mexico, Peru, Guatemala, Chile, Bolivia. At the international level, he's been involved with the Platform for Indigenous Peoples and local communities, as well as the Resilience Frontier Group under the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change. Also has a PhD, so we refer to him as Dr. Now, Dr. Alejandro.
No, just Alejandro, please.
Okay, fair enough. From the Joint Programming, Communication and Culture run by York University and Toronto Metropolitan University. His academic pursuits explore the intersection of decolonial computing, digital decoloniality, and Indigenous media. His approach is distinct, emphasizing the importance of Indigenous knowledge systems and ethical principles in digital design education. Great. I am so excited. So once again, thanks for the three for being here. Yeah, I'm so happy that you're all here, that I get to hang out with all of you. It's quite the pleasure. So thank you again from the bottom of my heart for being here. It really means a lot. So just for housekeeping rules, the way we're going to go is Natiea is going to go present, then James, and then Alejandro, and then there'll be a chance for questions at the end. If we go a little bit past the hour, if I'll be here, perhaps answer questions. If our speakers might, they're very busy. Happy to relay questions if they are unable to stick around. And further ado, I will stop talking because they're not here to see me. But Natiea, on to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Can everyone see? Is my video on? Yeah. Okay. And I made a little PowerPoint presentation. So let's see. Can you see this or no? No. Okay. It's annoying. One sec here. I'm having problems with Teams today, so my apologies. One sec.
Do not apologize. Everyone keep looking at native land. Explore the map while we wait here. That's fine. think of.
Yeah, I was going to say, it'd be nice to see that in the chat. See where everybody's from, and thanks, Jeff, for the introduction. I appreciate that. It was really nice, very kind.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing, interesting to think about where if Noel, maybe we can turn the chat on. If possible.
Yeah, I will work on that right now.
Thanks so much.
Okay, yeah, it's on. And I don't know if there's something I need to do for Natiea. Just looking.
I think it's because I need to update my computer.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I have anything here that I need to. I don't think. But the chat is on if anybody wants, if there's any questions or anything.
Oh, I think I figured it out.
Okay.
Let's try this. No, it says it quit and reopen.
Uh-oh.
Try this one more time, and otherwise I'll just have to give you my presentation without the beautiful slides, which would be unfortunate. But let's try it one more time, and then I know I have a hard stop at 12, and I'm sure other people do too. So at 12 Pacific time. So.
And Tia, what you can also do is you can email it to me, and I can just share my screen, and you just tell me when to move it around.
Okay.
Up to you.
It's saying that I can share this now. Is it coming up? No. Okay. I'll just email it to you, Jeff. You know what? I'm just gonna go for it. You can just look at my face instead. Sorry, everyone. Apologies. Hopefully we can do this again some other time because this is a huge topic and there's so much to talk about. Let's jump in. So good afternoon, good morning from depending on where you are in the world. I'm based in Vancouver on Musqueam territory. I live here with my husband and my 3-year-old daughter, Juniper. My name is Natiea Vinson, and I know there's been a few pronunciations of it, but I'm going to do this once, and I won't do it again, Natiea like papaya, because I hate doing it, but it's always worked for me, for people to remember how to pronounce my name. I'm a member of the Tecumloops Tisiquatum, and I'm the CEO of the First Nations Technology Council. I just started in this role about 4 months ago. I think 4 months to this day, actually. So thank you again to Jeff Hackett for inviting me to share a short presentation on the topic of Indigenous data sovereignty and I'd like to position it in terms of how our organization is going to be responding to meaningfully assist in this important area. So from what I understand, there's a pretty broad audience here in terms of knowledge and familiarity on the topic. So I'd like to start off by providing a short definition of Indigenous data sovereignty to contextualize the conversation. I also sometimes call it IDS for short, just because it's a bit of a mouthful to say over and over again. So IDS refers to the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to govern and control data about their communities, territories, and resources. It's rooted in self-determination, and it emphasizes the importance of Indigenous communities being the primary stewards and decision makers regarding their data and ensuring it aligns with our cultural values, our protocols, and our collective interests. People don't often associate Indigenous traditional knowledge with data, but our friends over at Anamiki in Victoria have outlined some great examples of traditional data systems in Indigenous cultures. And I had a really nice slide with a two-row wampum, but it's okay. Data has been a part of regalia, songs, art, languages, ceremonies, oral traditions, cultural teachings, and world creation stories. So all of these are good examples of Indigenous data usage, and they involve processes where information is recorded, stored, and analyzed. I think this is important to point out too, because it's really a visual indication of really complex civilizations that have existed for millennia before contact with European countries. Another example of traditional Indigenous data are wampum belts, as I referred to a second ago. used by the Haudenosaunee traditionally, and these belts are complex data systems that record, store, analyze, and share information, often made to record important treaties and other historical events. To people who don't know, they just look like pretty beads on a piece of moose hide, but they're actually very complex data systems in and of themselves. Indigenous data sovereignty has gained traction across the globe over the past few decades as Indigenous communities assert their rights over data concerning their people, lands, cultures, traditions. And I had a PowerPoint list here of all the different groups working or a subset of groups working across the world on this. I saw that someone was calling in from Hawaii, New Zealand, and there's Indigenous communities in all of these places around the world that have nonprofits and other grassroots organizations working to fight for Indigenous data sovereignty. The common thread among these organizations, of course, is the assertion of inherent rights of Indigenous people over their data, recognizing that control over data equates to self-determination and the protection of Indigenous cultures, languages, and traditions. So something I thought that I would throw in here, and I'm not sure it's entirely appropriate, but it's something that as I'm reading, and I thought this might be an interesting thing to kind of add, is something that the EU has done with respect to their data sovereignty. And they are primarily concerned with protecting their citizens from US companies, of course, but they've been in this quest, they've been a bit of a pioneer for setting robust policy standards and governing frameworks related to data sovereignty. And it's called the General Data Protection Regulation. And the GDPR, for short, emphasizes several principles that align with the broader notions of data sovereignty. So they, first of all, require organizations and companies to obtain clear affirmative consent from individuals before collecting and using their data. That data should be collected, or that data that is collected should be limited to what's necessary for the intended purpose. How many times have we signed up for things and we get our information sent to other companies and we're getting spammed all over the place? Transparency: organizations must clearly communicate how they use it and they're going to use it. The right to be forgotten, and I love this one because I love this idea of leaving no digital trace on the internet of myself. Obviously, that's not going to happen in this world that we're in now, but it's something that, I don't know, it's almost a new status symbol, being able to kind of to erase yourself from a digital footprint. So the right to be forgotten is a little bit different. It allows individuals to have their data erased within the company under certain conditions. And the last tenet is data portability, which allows individuals to receive their data in a commonly used format, and they can transmit this data to another organization. So if we think about, I don't know, banking, it might be a good example for that. Of course, there's differences between the broader consumer citizen-focused aims of the GDPR in the EU and the specific cultural, political, and social context that Indigenous data sovereignty deals with. Again, the GDPR is a regulation aimed at protecting individual data rights in a commercial and governmental context. Indigenous data sovereignty encompasses collective rights, and it's tied deeply to self-determination and cultural preservation. So we can't talk about Indigenous data sovereignty without talking about OCAP. And I think probably everyone's familiar with OCAP, so I won't spend too much time on it, but the ownership, control, access, and possession principles are developed by Canada's very own First Nations Information Governance Centre based in Ontario. And it's been fundamental in shaping the conversation around Indigenous data sovereignty for Indigenous peoples, but also on the flip side, on how it's almost a guide for how non-Indigenous researchers and governments and institutions can engage with Indigenous communities regarding their data. So OCAP provides a clear framework for how data related to Indigenous communities should be handled. It asserts, of course, that First Nations have ownership, control, access, and possession of their data. So as a standalone ideal, Indigenous data sovereignty is essential as we navigate Indigenous rights in the digital age. And I also like to highlight, though, that data sovereignty is integral to good governance, and it underpins Indigenous sovereignty as a whole. If we think about all of the areas Indigenous governments are responsible for, including but not limited to lands, housing, public works, public safety, laws, social services, citizenship, all of this comprises qualitative and quantitative aspects to data, and they're integral to how these systems are functioning and for effective decision making. In many cases, probably folks calling in from Canada will understand that the Indian Act controls a lot of this information firsthand, and this is disempowering and further promotes that First Nation governments are corrupt or not competent enough to manage their own systems. So electoral systems is one example. You know, we still have 200 First Nations in Canada that hold their elections under the Indian Act and the Indian Band election regulation. This means the government of Canada controls their election process and outcomes. And this is data that should be completely owned and controlled by the community. Membership, citizenship, again, the Indian Act also keeps track and determines who is Indigenous according to the federal government's records and standards. And in short, this is data, and the federal government has defined the very nature of Indigenous identity and membership and sense of belonging to a community through data that they hold. And then last, or not last, but another piece to good governance is being able to meaningfully implement free, prior, and informed consent, which is a tenet from UNDRIP. And data sovereignty is absolutely necessary to be able to implement FPIC. So in order to exercise FPIC, a given First Nation community needs to control their own data with respect to logistics and coordination. And I'd like to just call out Anamiki again. They have a great quote on this. So First Nations communities need to determine how to objectively and transparently share any relevant project data. They should be the ones who determine when, where, and how meetings and decisions take place in a language and format of their choosing. So I talked a lot about FPIC in a course I was teaching at SFU as an instrument that companies really need to bring when they're trying to work with Indigenous communities and trying to get a project done on their land. But if we think about the flip side, and Indigenous communities needing to meaningfully be able to engage with that process of FPIC goes back to being able to control their data. So it's really important that that we have the tools and the ability to actually exercise a lot of this with a lot of the tools around data management. So there's a couple of blockers to Indigenous data sovereignty. Infrastructure and capacity are the main two. So we all know First Nations access to high-speed internet in Canada is lagging behind the general population. The Auditor General put out a report on connectivity on rural and remote areas. The last report was done in 2021, which found, no shocker, 91% of households across Canada had internet access that met the minimum connection speed targets. But once you get to rural and remote areas, that drops to 60% and again drops down to 43% when you talk about households on reserves. Digital transformation is also really important. So connectivity is of course a precursor to information and data management, but often what happens is once that improved connectivity is established for First Nations, nations then struggle to embrace digital transformation to enhance their logistics and operations. People are coming out of left, right, and center, asking First Nations to be involved in every project. They want consent, they want their engagement and their participation, but staff and leadership are overburdened and they don't always have the tools to be able to respond to things. So the burden of sharing this accurate information with the larger community as well often falls to community leadership or staff who don't always have the resources they need to do the job. And furthermore, they don't always have the tools that is needed to translate and distribute data. And then furthermore, data sets generated by outsiders are either convoluted, bureaucratic, or just non-existent. So at the Technology Council, we've got 4 mandates that have been given to us by the First Nations Leadership Council, which represents all 204 First Nations in the province of BC. Our mandates are digital skills training, improved internet connectivity, technical support services, and information management. And because we don't have core funding, surprise, surprise, we are very limited in what we can do with respect to our research and programming and services. And I see Alejandro laughing because he understands the pain of balancing being an Indigenous org that doesn't have core funding. So much time and energy is spent on trying to access funds to keep our lights on and our doors open. And it really detracts from our ability to deliver on the good work that we want to do. So in the coming years, we have a plan to support Indigenous data sovereignty. We are already doing it with a variety of training programs. We have 18 in-house digital skills training programs that we've developed with Indigenous learners in mind. And where possible, we have these programs delivered by Indigenous instructors. And we train on average over 300 Indigenous students per year. We work on advocacy and awareness. This is an example doing talks like this. We want to raise the importance, awareness about the importance of Indigenous data sovereignty among communities, policymakers, the general public. We've got plans to do research, to engage in research that explores best practices, tools, and methodologies for IDS. And then eventually we'd like to offer training, workshops, and resources to help communities develop their capacities in data management, technology, and governance. So my last two, well, I have here the last two slides, but my last 2 points are on the role of technology and data sovereignty. At its core, of course, technology offers tools and platforms that can either advance or hinder the principles of IDS. And Jeff talked about that at the beginning. And so there's a bit of a breakdown here in ways technology kind of intersects with Indigenous data sovereignty. We've got data collection and storage. Technology facilitates the collection of vast amounts of data on various aspects, including health, education, economic activities, cultural practices. This data, if controlled and managed by Indigenous communities, can provide essential insights for them to guide policy and decision-making within those communities. Data access and sharing is really important. Modern tech allows for selective data sharing, meaning Indigenous communities can determine who gets access to specific data sets. Platforms can be designed to give varying levels of access to different stakeholders, respecting the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty. Cultural preservation, we're starting to see examples with VR, AR, AI, and other digital repositories that can play a role in preserving and sharing Indigenous cultures, languages. These tools can help keep traditions alive and make them accessible to younger generations. And then, of course, we all know Native people love Facebook and other social media. These tools can help foster community discussions and consensus building around data-related decisions. That gets a little bit tricky, obviously. It's a double-edged sword with respect to all of these points. When wielded with community guidance, it can advance the principles of Indigenous data sovereignty, but it's always essential to be aware of its potential misapplications and ensure that technology serves the community needs and not the other way around. And AI is on everyone's mind these days. AI has the potential to significantly benefit Indigenous communities in their quest for data sovereignty. AI can assist with preservation and revitalization of Indigenous languages, analyzing historical recordings, facilitating modern translations. The Lakota AI Code Camp, which some of you may have heard about, run by Michael Running Wolf and Mason Grimshaw, is an example where they're using a combination of Lakota culture and artificial intelligence to help preserve and teach the Lakota language. Conversely, one of the biggest challenges of AI directly touches on our topic today, which is data privacy and control. Using AI involves sharing data, of course, with external tools, LLMs that are built by non-Indigenous people, and ensuring that this data remains under the sovereignty of Indigenous communities is vital. And how we do that, I don't know. And I'm hoping to learn from other speakers and a community of practice and how we all support one another in trying to support this. So there's a lot more to discuss, but hopefully this was a helpful way to start the conversation. And I apologize again for the technical issues at the beginning. So that's enough for me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Nataea. Really appreciate it. Excellent. That's a great way to really establish that foundation and yeah, demonstrate that there's these overarching challenges in the space and barriers, but also further, if we remove those, what are the potentials and potential issues around, like, what, the opportunities and challenges in implementing these things. That was a very poorly crafted sentence. So I know you have a hard stop at 12, so we'll hopefully get to the end of it, because I'm sure people will be asking questions about that, about some of the programs that you're working on, and see, yeah, maybe there's some government folks here that can talk and speak to core funding, perhaps, so thank you very much. So James, up next.
Excellent, excellent. Natiea, wonderful presentation. So glad you're here. Jeff, thank you, of course. And Alejandro, wonderful to see you again. Really good work we're all doing here. Lots of friends and relatives are on the call here today, which is really great. Can everybody hear me okay? Great, excellent, thank you. Natiea really laid the framework here. She laid down the blanket for us to do the good work. And this is what we're doing here today. Little introduction. James Delorme. I'm a member of Klahoose First Nation. They're Coast Salish. I was the Hagoose there for 6 years. I was a elected chief of Klahoose. Klahoose are Coast Salish, but they're not I'm not from Klahoose. My family are actually from Treaty 4. Dad is from Cowessess First Nation. My Mushum, my grandfather's from Cowessess. My grandmother's from Kakawistau. So it's a story of innovation. I transferred to Klahoose through the Indian Act. I became chief. The elders there asked me to. I became chief through the Indian Act, a colonial system that's damaged us. But I used that opportunity to help support the Klahoose people and to herald technology solutions and help our communities. And that's my passion. That's what I've been doing probably since the birth of the internet that I can remember. So I'm going to show my age a little bit. Today, I'm coming to you from the Lheidli T'enneh territories. I'm a visitor here. I also have my business in these territories. I grew up on the BC coast. Dad was in the armed forces. I was born in Nova Scotia, so blue noser. But my mother comes from Manitoba, and they're settlers, so Scottish and Icelandic. So I kind of refer to myself as Indigenous Viking. It's funny, everybody laughs. But I want to recognize my privilege. I'm privileged because I know where my ancestors come from. And the reason why I know that is because my elders taught me. They told me. They used that work, that cultural work of passing those traditions on, and they brought that to me. So I say privileged because I know that our family and relatives, a lot of us don't know. Residential school, 60 scoop, there's various systems that we've had to endure as Indigenous people that have caused such great harm and discord. And I'm doing my best as an individual through my mentorship from my elders to be an example as best I can. So that's the leadership role I am. So no longer Hey Goose, I'm no longer chief. I was elected chief, but I still have to maintain that standard because that's our cultural way. These are our cultural practices. And a lot of people ask me, okay, James, how does that work within a decentralized system that you're working on with your company? Well, it actually goes hand in hand. And if you actually go back to some very simple ideas of what technology is, they're protocols, they're code, they're pieces of data that are used to represent information, data. But what goes along with that? There's another piece of protocols that are going on. It's our cultural teachings. So you see a parallel there as we move forward. We can either let one be the paramount or the other, or we can have harmony between the two. So this is why I'm here. I'm not going to go into systems specifically because I do understand them, and this is what I do. Data governance is a huge piece of my work. Information management, information technology, Natiea, thank you so much for mentioning OCAP. I've worked so extensively with First Nations Information Data Governance Council. I see that there's some folks from that group here. OCAP principles are really a foundational piece that we need to move forward with data governance. So that being said, just to go more into my introduction, I am CEO of my own company called indigilink.io, but I'm not here self-promotion. I'm here because I'm here to guide, to help be however I can be for this group. Please reach out to me. I'll put some of my info on the chat. I'll continue to go on afterwards. Jeff and team, if you need me to have a discussion after the top of the hour, I'm glad to be here. And I would love to connect with anybody who wants to talk about. Oh, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. And just to build off what Natiea was saying, and I'm sure that Alejandro is going to, really drive this home. I'm going to give you some examples of data sovereignty. So let's get that from the community perspective. Okay, so forget I'm chief. Think of me as a community member at Klahoose. And one of the things that we always did was we harvested food. It was every fall, the chum would come and we'd clean the fish. We would hang them, we'd smoke them. The reason for that is because we needed to have that sustenance throughout the winter. And some young people actually came up to me and they said, "Why is this so important to you, James? Why are you doing this all the time?" And I explained, that it was the elders taught me this. This is our cultural practice: to harvest food, prepare for the winter. And what they asked me, what has that got to do with being Klahoose? And I said, it's everything to do with being Klahoose. What has it got to do with our culture? That is our culture. Everything that we are, we breathe, everything we do every day to help our people, to help our relatives, to show our allies, many are here today, our Indigenous lens is that greater piece of our own sovereignty. Because I had to explain that to these young people, that this information that we have, that teaching that I was given by these elders, belongs to the Klahoose, doesn't belong to the general population. Another example is I was taught how to make traditional Coast Salish canoe bailers. Now they're not not well known, but I do have that knowledge base and came from my elders. Norman Harry Sr. taught me. That data is very specific to the Klahoose and various other Coast Salish peoples. So it's actually worth quite a bit. This is the colonial side of things. A canoe baler is actually worth a lot of money. Most people see them as collector items, but I see this as Klahoose's knowledge. Now, even though I'm in Lheidli T'enneh territory, which I'm so happy to be in these traditional territories, but I always remember that the teachings that I had from Klahoose are going to be, they're sacred to them and they belong to them. So that's my commitment. As when I go out in the world, I let people know that belongs to them. So that just gives you another example of that data governance, and the complete discussion that Natiea. We don't have enough time, folks. We're going to be here for weeks, quite honestly, because when you start to really dive, get into the weeds, like in the tech sector, we're always talking about getting into the weeds of a project. You start getting into the weeds of the Indian Act, and you start getting into the weeds of the Indigenous lens, you do start to see that we're just scratching the surface. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I do want to express that we need more community champions. We need more allyship, and we need more money. Just like Natiea says, we need large tech companies to start investing. One good thing is that the federal government, spent some money on data governance with First Nations Information Data Governance Center. And that's a national strategy that's going on throughout Canada, which is wonderful. In the US, there's some wonderful things. You mentioned that AI work specifically with language revitalization with Carol and Michael Running Wolf. Unbelievable projects that are taking place, and AI, being the center of that. So, but I'm not here to talk about those things because those are layers on top of the foundation, which is the Indigenous lens. Internet connectivity, number one. Understanding communities, number two. making sure that we have community champions that are driving this, and then leadership need to be behind it. Those are core solutions that we really have to keep going on. We're doing a great job. And the First Nations Tech Council is heralding that training and that capacity building, and also being a really strong advocate with the government. And I've worked for the government on connectivity, so I understand. I was a chief, I understand. But I also understand the community and that community point of view, and that is critical. So folks, I'll be here. You can always message me and ask me more questions. But you're just scratching the surface on data governance and data strategy, and there's a lot of different things, barriers that we're facing, absolutely. And with the generative AI, decentralized technologies, that gap is getting wider and wider for us, and we got to do something fast. So, thank you for taking time here. So what I said in Klahoos is, I feel good. Not maybe in the James Brown way, I'm not too sure. I feel good. Da, da, da. But I said that we come from this place and that we're all related. And in the grand discussion about the global mindset, we are all related. And I'm glad to be here and share my message today. Thank you, Jeff. Whoa.
Thanks, James. Always inspiring to hear you bring those stories from community. I think that's really an important part in this whole discussion, is really rooting everything in community. Because yeah, I think when you see all these spaces out there, there's a technical solution for everything, right? But is it appropriate? Is it right? Is it Indigenous led? And I think that's where everything needs to start from. So thank you again for being here. And last up, we have Alejandro.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. Please let me know about the time, because I know that we are limited on time. It's an honor for me to be with James and Natiea again. We have seen each other several times, and it's great to see both of you again. I think you can see my screen now. Yes, excellent, excellent. Well, today I'm very excited with all of you to share with you a little bit of the story of IFA and how we are tackling Indigenous data sovereignty and why it's so important. And let me tell you that it's important not just for nations, but for the youth. Why the youth are getting engaged in Indigenous data sovereignty. A little bit of what you can see here is a little bit of Cree knowledge, how like the teachings of the racing at TP, and how that is intersecting with technology, and how actually we are sharing the fire, sharing that fire that is within the TP, sharing with more and more youth. Of course, this art is created by an amazing artist, Gista Kennedy. You can follow him. Gista is Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, and he has bringing a lot of this great work that you are going to see throughout my presentation. So who I am and why I'm talking to you today. Tlen Akinking Wanikan Alejandro. Hello, my name is Alejandro. I spoke in the Totonac language that is spoke in the eastern part of Mexico. And I have been in 9 years in Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Chippewas territory, what is called now Toronto. And learning about this cross-nation collaboration. As I always say, I'm from the tail of Turtle Island. I always on that tail. But learning about how actually it's so important to collaborate, and actually in the digital, because all nations, we're in the digital, we are sharing the digital space. So how we are collaborating in order to get to that digital sovereignty, to that data sovereignty. I want to share with you a story, a very impactful story that happened to me not long ago. So I had the privilege that I was traveling 2 weeks ago, and I landed in Barcelona, Spain. And in Barcelona, Spain, I was aware that I was going to be with all of you today. And I found this. It was in the archives of Barcelona. And this is the original contract of Christopher Columbus with the King and Queen of Spain to come to discover, quotes, discover what is called the Americas. But I think it gives a little bit of perspective of what is going on with Indigenous data sovereignty. It's basically the contract that legitimized all the extraction of not just natural resources, but everything related to Indigenous peoples. I highlighted, like, this is from 1492. If you remember, that's the day that everyone is praising about the discovery of America. So, and actually it was about all the type of goods, anything that Christopher Columbus or any of his crew were gonna go to find, actually they were able and they were entitled to take out. And what is ironic about this is that we are talking about archives. And now this is a big asset and this is protected by UNESCO. Now we are begging for indigenous data sovereignty. We are trying to create protection, and you can see the contrast on this document. But I think this brings a little bit of perspective of where this is coming from. This is not coming from the digital era. This is coming from a long time ago, from the process of colonization. And of course, now with the digital is becoming more and more complex. I think for everyone, it's very important to understand what do we mean with indigenous data? And actually, what are the types of indigenous data that we have nowadays? And especially because if we want to start protecting that data, we need to understand the type of data that nations are owning. So we have first the data about indigenous resources and environments. We have land, water, geology, soil, sacred sites. Of course, guess who are the ones that are very interested in this topic? Mining companies, extraction companies, because of course we have been in the land for millennia, and now of course knowing all this knowledge is very, very meaningful, and it has a lot of impact. Second, data about indigenous peoples as individuals. This is has been collected by the governments, administrative, legal, health, social, commercial, all these numbers that are running statistics all the time. And finally, and this is a very important topic for a lot of the youth, the data about indigenous peoples as collectives. That is about our stories, our literature, our songs, our dances, our ceremonies. So these three are very different, and actually they require different protections. And that's why it's important to start categorizing this knowledge. And then is when we can bring the topic of indigenous data sovereignty, the right of indigenous peoples and nations to govern, collect, own, and apply their own data, right? And it's so important. There is a lot of collectives like the Open Development Initiative and the University of Arizona. Sorry, I'm just covering. And the University of Arizona that actually they have been working on this for several years. And I think it's just important to start understanding the complexities of indigenous data, because if we want to start protecting and start creating tools, and this is very important, how we are going to ground these concepts in something that actually nations, actually communities can apply at the ground level. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, a little bit of understanding of what is going on, I don't have a lot of time left, but from a legal perspective, of course, and I think already Nataea and my other colleague was explaining very, very passionate about it. There is first a structural gap. There is, of course, that gap between traditional knowledge and of course, when we are trying to protect, and especially when we are trying to protect indigenous data from the public domain. Because something that happened, and that's why I show you the contract of Christopher Columbus, that now it's protected, and there is an entire national archive that is protecting this knowledge, because with traditional knowledge, commonly in the past, this traditional knowledge was assumed to be part of the public domain. So everyone can use traditional knowledge. I have always used this example, yoga. All of us we heard about yoga, and there is a lot of types of yoga. Yoga is a very specific traditional knowledge, but from a very specific community in India. And now this has been part of the public domain, and now everyone is talking about yoga and adapting yoga in many different ways. So this misappropriation of traditional knowledge is a big problem. So of course there is a big structural gap, because when we start talking about traditional knowledge as property, these create tensions, because for many nations there is no property as such. And especially when we are talking about sacred items, when we are talking about sacred sites, when we are talking about sacred knowledge, we don't talk about property. So there is a mismatch when we are trying to protect, because we are transforming the knowledge. there is a structural gap that, of course, we need to rethink the entire system. How we can start thinking in many different ways, not just legal ways, but in many different other ways to start protecting data. Then there is the functional gaps, of course, and here is the Open principles. And I am gonna share with all of you these two initiatives that I think are very important. Local context that is an initiative that started in the University of New York with Professor Jane Anderson about protecting traditional knowledge in the digital space, and especially in the Glamosphere, in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, and how so it's important that actually nations, communities have the control of their data. And of course, the care principles that have been shared and spread across different nations on how actually these principles need to be attached when we are trying to protect indigenous data. The problem a little bit of creating this type of applying these principles into traditional knowledge is we're going to encounter three main problems. One is about attribution. The traditional knowledge sometimes comes from many different sources. It's not just from one specific nation. Sometimes different nations share the same knowledge, and there is variations of that knowledge. So the attribution to say who is the author of a specific piece of knowledge is a little bit challenging. So we need to start thinking that there might be multiple authors or multiple nations that own that knowledge. Now, having control, who is going to have control of that knowledge? Who is going to decide? And this is about what Nataea was talking about, governance. The governance of the knowledge is going to be the First Nations Council. It's going to be a group within the community who is going to have the control. And of course, in the case of traditional knowledge starts creating remuneration, who are going to get the profit of that remuneration? And this is a very, very sensitive topic, because in a lot of nations, we shouldn't be profiting from traditional knowledge. But there are tensions because there are different nations that own the same knowledge. And finally, when we go into more specifics, and when let's say we want to protect our traditional knowledge from a big corporate or a big company, of course, there is limitations with the copyright, with trademarks, with patents, because of course they are Western tools, and now we need to use them in order to protect them, to protect traditional knowledge. Now, this is a little bit of the challenges that we are facing with traditional knowledge. Of course, I don't have time to explain each of them, but they overall explain a little bit of the challenges when we are talking about storytelling. The storytelling is not fixed. The storytelling, there are many ways to say the same story, and they are oral. You cannot just like record a piece and that could be the only piece to protect. There are many ways that story can pass over the other generations. So this is a little bit, of course, in the terms of protection. Originally, the terms of protection of any piece was 50 years. Disney, the company, extended that term of protection because, of course, profit to 70 years in many jurisdictions. But traditional knowledge is millennial. So how you are going to protect something in that has been passing generation over generation? And now, and I know that we are almost on time. Just now we have these five players, and we are in one of them. We are in Microsoft Teams. But we have Google, we have Meta, we have Apple, we have Amazon. That actually they have becoming these big data extraction companies. So now how traditional knowledge needs to be protected, but at the same time, how actually we need to engage on those platforms. As Nataea was saying, a lot of our youth are using Facebook. And of course, they are sharing the knowledge on Facebook. So it's so important how we can engage, how we can start creating protection on this type of traditional knowledge when we are using these platforms. And it's so important that actually youth get involved. And that's why we are as an organization, we're encouraging youth to get involved into technology. Because now for us, it's so important that they bring the solutions. because they can see the two worlds. They can see the digital world, but also they have the traditional knowledge. And bringing the ethics of traditional knowledge into the design of technology is so important, because as we have been saying, it's so important to bring the land, bring the environment into the design of technology, because we cannot have indigenous data sovereignty if we don't protect the environment, if we don't protect the land. So it's so important to bring these principles when we are designing technology. So in the new social media that is going to be created, we need to consider the land. We need to consider community. We need to bring those. And how we're going to do it is basically with the youth being on the table and bringing this perspective into the design of technology. And this is why we are so passionate about the work of bringing indigenous youth that are having all these knowledge and all these traditions into the digital tech companies, because they can bring the solutions that now we are facing with climate change. Now that we are facing about all the environmental issues. Right now in Canada, we have the wildfires. You're going to have an emergency just today and yesterday because the wildfires are expanding. So it's so important that now when we are thinking about the digital, we think about the environment. So with that being said, I'm going to just close here with Jeff, because I know that we're limited on time and I want to give a little bit of a space. But thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward for engaging later, and I'm happy to stay.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. I know you had to blast through so many details of that, but super inspiring what you're doing, and even what you said, and bringing up some of these greater issues. And I'm trying to think here, and this is I was thinking maybe, I know Nataea, you have to head out soon, and maybe I don't know if you want to take a crack at this one, but I'm thinking of like AI machine learning as using social media to train its models. Or we saw earlier Zoom not too long, like a week and a half ago, changed its terms of service, that now it will be using the transcripts, the video to train its model, right? Unless you give consent or to retract it. So it's always, everything's opt-in, right? And you have to opt out. Everything should be opt-in, but everything's opt-out now. So like if you don't know, you are training an AI model. And so what are the implications when we think of how, when we indigenous knowledge is kind of in terms of its extractive nature, kind of permeating all these data sets that are now, you have the indigenous knowledge being put into and training AI data sets, right? As a kind of collective process without having any of the protocols and traditional laws behind it. So does any, like, what do you think of, like, is there a place for these technologies, right? Or is it like, do nations really have to set up data governance and proper governance processes before we even think about engaging these technologies? I know, Nataea, you're the first one, and that was like a long kind of like open-ended, is AI machine learning? How do nations use it, right? When you think about maps have been colonial in all their processes in terms of extractive natures. But nations have kind of figured out in a way of using Western maps to change the narrative, right? So what's the possibility here with that type of tech?
I'm so sorry. I was just writing a note that I have to run. I have a super important meeting, and I'm already late, and I have to pee. So I'm really sorry.
Okay.
I think that James and Alejandro will do a good job at answering this. Thank you, everyone.
No problem.
Thank you, Nataea. Good to see you.
Okay. I love the oversharing. I'm guilty of that all the time too. Yeah, either buzzwords, right? Blockchain is a solution for everything, right? How do we monetize? So yeah, so go Alejandro. I feel it's there.
Especially about blockchain, and this has been in. I have been part of several circles. Of course, blockchain came with a very good purpose and intentions to actually democratize a lot of different information systems, which is great, But we need to acknowledge that at least, especially at the beginning, blockchain created a lot of pollution, because in order to do the mining of that blockchain, you require a lot of energy, and you require a lot of cloud systems and infrastructure to maintain that running. So if we are going to try to focus on blockchain as a way to bring data sovereignty, it's so important that we acknowledge the environmental impact. And we need to find solutions. There are already some progressive blockchain solutions that are focusing more on also the energy consumption, because there has been several publications where you can see the correlation between the gas emissions, because now the data servers are like being overused in order to process all the data mining of the blockchain. And of course, as you know, the part of the technology is that the blockchain continues growing and growing and growing, and you require more power when it expands, right? That was especially at the beginning, that was the logic. That now there are other new technologies that might differ a little bit on that, but I think it's so important just to acknowledge the environmental impact. And the second thing is very, very important as well. Is I have seen so many organizations that are going to communities, bringing blockchain and bringing all these solutions, but they are outsiders. They are not creating the capacity at the local level. So the problem is when you bring a solution, whatever it is, to a new solution without creating capacity at the local level, you are creating a dependency. A dependency from an external source. So it's so important that when we are talking about these new technologies, we also need to think about how we are going to educate the communities in order for them to take control of the technology. And maybe they might decide not to use it. And that's the thing. Maybe they are going to say, we don't like it. This is not what we need. I'm sorry. It's very cool. It's very nice, but we don't need it. And I think to make those kind of decisions are so important. Many organizations, they don't want to because, what are we going to do if they say no? Well, this is part of sovereignty. This is part of governance. You are teaching a technology and the community can decide if they want to use it.
Yeah, that's great, Alejandro. It's such a big discussion, but I think it really does come down to, environmental, of course, and obviously there's different solutions within decentralized models. But I actually bring it back down to that granular community level. And we've been doing decentralization for probably forever. So like those models are actually, they're ingrained in our communities. For instance, we used to trade all the time between nations. So I use that model with the self-sovereign identity work that I do. And just to give folks a sort of concept of the idea of where decentralization is and where it is, the context of modern systems that are going to be implemented, we're a long way off, folks. Like really, I mean, we're just scraping the technologies scope of 5G technologies, never mind whether adoption of cryptocurrencies are going to be, used in First Nations communities. The research I've been doing is probably over the last 5-6 years. And it continues on. And one of the key pieces at the foundational level of all those technologies is that you got to have the Indigenous land. We have to be part of the conversation because we need to have, as Alejandro mentioned, it's that you have to get that center of trust. Decentralization is trust. Data governance is trust. So if you have that model at the idea going forward and not the colonial sense of we know what's best, you actually adopt a system that actually works. So maybe a decentralized model is going to work for one group of folks. It may not work over here. But having the chance to dialogue on those things is really important. And early adoption, so community champions that are actually understand what it is, because even internet connectivity, we're still just scratching the surface, and we need more community champions that understand exactly what's going on. So there's a level of education we're still trying to catch up to. And so those systems are really valid, but I'll go just give my personal opinion. I'm a Bitcoin guy. I love it. I love the systems. I'm a Fediment guy. So everybody's going, what the heck are you talking about, James? So imagine me going to a community and saying, hey, I think you should try a BTC solution on get an AI, second layer AI into that solution, and we're going to do some pretty amazing things financially. That is inappropriate, unbelievably inappropriate. So Megan's just showing some really interesting information. And Megan is just an amazing person to talk to as an Indigenous person in the space. But she actually focused on, Alejandro, that environmental piece, which is really critical. Anyways, data sovereignty, you bang on, Alejandro. Yeah, we need to understand these systems more. Thank you.
I'm trying to think of where do we start, right? I know, like, and this is part of like, and we're all part of the community of practice, right? Because everyone's doing their little thing here, and it's a close, like, everyone's in their own silos. Because it's not only we don't have the opportunity to just sit here and focus on data sovereignty. There's a whole other slew of problems, issues that are happening, right? So, yeah, where do we start? How do we like if instead of creating redundancies where someone here asked like, hey, where can I get a data sharing agreement for between a First Nation and not for profit, right? I've had trouble asking a lawyer firm for, hey, can you give me something? We'll pay for it, but it's gonna be our like we want to distribute it for free, and they're like, we're not really comfortable with that, right? So how do we support each other and through this environment? Like where's the starting point?
Yeah, I could lead with that.
Yeah.
Precisely, bang on, Jeff. Where do you start? Where do you, a lot of folks come to me and they say, James, how do I talk to a community? Where do I start? You have to start. Like, you cannot stop yourself from getting those conversations going. So that's the key piece is, okay, you found, this is a typical text situation, Jeff. You found a problem. So how do we do that in the tech sector? We find a solution, and it's usually a text. But this is a little deeper because you have to start to go in, okay, well, we haven't actually done this yet. It's a disruptive. This is a disruptive work that's taking place. And that's why I always call myself a disruptor, because it's basically what I do. It's my life. Who knows? How did I get here? But the thing is, Jeff, is you're right. How do we get to that point where we're understanding what those data governance pieces mean? How do they relate to, say, one organization working with another organization? And then what if you come across a community that they're still under the Indian Act? They're still doing band council resolutions to the federal government, which is a really important thing to remember, is that the government requires chief and councils to report everything that they're doing. If you make a change to your sewer system, if you make a decision in the community on violence, if you make a decision on purchasing a vehicle for your maintenance, that information has to go to the federal government for their records. That clearly, I only know this because I was a chief, that clearly breaks any data sovereignty right away or off the hop. So you got to think about those foundational pieces of what is the origins and why are we even talking about data? It should be pretty simple, right? But we have to create this disruption. We have to be the leaders that say, I just had a discussion with the chief yesterday, and it's how do we make this sustainable for our communities? And we have to have that allyship with groups like lawyers, as you mentioned, that are saying, yeah, we've got a solution here. We want to share that with you. And we think it's beneficial, to be adopted somewhere else. So it's that allyship and understanding where we come from as Indigenous people, and then finding those solutions like in the tech sector to really drive innovation home. And we already have some tools with OCAP. We already have the First Nations Health Authority, who through chiefs and assembly have agreed that OCAP principles are a part of this. So if you see, there's already work going into that data governance and data strategy. But we have to do that also for our communities. That'll keep going. Thank you.
I think, Jeff, and I would like to add, very aligned to what James just mentioned. I think, and I want to bring Arthur Manuel, this big activist, First Nation activist, that actually brought a lot of the indigenous issues about land in Canada to the United Nations. And I think, and of course, we need to just to be careful to, of course, acknowledge the differences of all nations. But now when we are talking about data sovereignty, we need to come together, because now we are playing against big guys. We are talking about big tech that are bigger than national states. They are bigger than Canada now, for example, in our context. So how we are going to play with those actors if we don't come together? So there is with allyship, I think it's also how we are coming together and start bringing understandings. What do we have in common? How do we understand sovereignty, and how we can start creating strategies to fight back? And I remember Arthur Manuel used to hate the word indigenous, because indigenous, I'm not indigenous. Like indigenous is a created word. It's a created word. I'm Mohawk, I'm Cree, I'm Anishinaabe, but I'm not indigenous. But the indigenous word was created and actually to bring people together. It was actually we have something in common and we are fighting a system. So of course we need to acknowledge the differences of all nations, but actually now the digital, we are all using the same digital infrastructure. So how we are going to start playing in this ecosystem. So I think that is also another step. And I already mentioned it during my presentation, is also about education. And I think the youth need to get engaged. Now we have a new generation that they know more about the digital than any of us. They are always teaching me about what is new in Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, all these different platforms. And I think when they can bring this into the governance part, I think we can create a big change.
Thank you. Just kind of an interesting thing is I'm like a big privacy person, thinking about data sovereignty for a long time now. I don't have social media other than LinkedIn, which is still social media, but and I think a lot. And I know that communities use Facebook heavily, right? Yeah, these companies, these monoliths are pulling so much data out, right? And to tell people you don't have social media is like, why, right? It's like it's the social pressure to engage. So it's like this weird environment that. So I think about all these kind of ubiquitous extraction points across everything are scary. I think of the folks, sending sometimes sensitive data, not like understanding OCAP and data sovereignty, but sending a sensitive file, not thinking about it through Gmail, right? And so, yeah, this kind of speaks to like, when you pay for services, you pay for like your Proton mails or whatnot, right? Like you're buying a product instead of being the product. And I think that's like kind of we have to, yeah, it's interesting space. It's scary at times, and I don't have any solutions or whatnot. And I think Alejandro, you brought up something really good, and like local context. Someone else mentioned that before. And I think one of the difficult things is that, like, yeah, nations can go you can go Google data governance framework. You get like a pretty robust template that any medium, large size, business could make it their own and then implement it, right? But it doesn't contain the traditional laws and protocols, right? And I think that's the difficulty, is that with OCAP there are these 4 principles, but they will be reflected completely differently on the ground in the community as a reflection of those. So and what does that look like? And it's a journey to get there, which is difficult, expensive, right? And like we talk about funding, just for nations to find funding that is specifically on this, it does, like on data sovereignty, it doesn't exist, right? So it's like, how do we get creative with funding? And this is always like part of nation building funding pots, right? And that is part of it. So yeah, I don't, trying to think of other than local context, like, do either of you have some ideas perhaps around innovative ways to like incorporate traditional laws and protocols, right? And I think of like water data, right? And you might talk to the people from who are the hard science universities, like, we don't want the stories around it. We want just the mercury levels. We want the turbidity, right? But like for an Indigenous science perspective, like you can't divorce those two things. They're one and the same, right? So when you're thinking of open data sets, what are the difficulties when you're trying to talk about these things, right? And is the local context is like a great solution around metadata labels? Are there anything else in your experience you think you could that is around that might be a viable solution?
James.
What I was just going to talk about the context of very specifically examples that are happening in the north. Folks are having to flee Yellowknife now, and so when you start to go, okay, well, how does that affect data governance, data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty? Right now they're in panic stages. Did we back up everything? Are we storing all that information? So the only reason I'm saying this because I worked for the Dene Nation. So National Chief Gerald Antoine, I've worked very closely as advisor with him. And what I'm seeing up there right now is just terrible. It's unbelievable. But with the fires, the people having to flee, their houses are in flames. But there's also digital mapping that's taking place where actually it penetrates below the topical ground. And that data on geospatial technology has the ability to give all kinds of data about not only the current state of that environment, it gives 3D imaging, but it also forecasts through AI technology the various future, past state opportunities for that data to be used in decisions that are going to be made at a large scale government level. So where are the Indigenous people in all that? Right? It's technology companies are constantly being ahead of the curve and saying, okay, we got geospatial technology. We've got this technology through the federal government. We're applying that in the north. But how is that really benefiting the folks in those regions? So and so I only bring that up because you were asking about examples. Well, a lot of times we're reacting to situations versus being proactive.
Yeah.
So that's not just within technology. This is with all of our communities everywhere. So we're dealing with reactive to environmental concerns, we're reactive to cultural concerns, we're reactive to deaths that are happening in our community. So what we have, my opinion, is that we have to find solutions that are actually thinking future state. How's that going to benefit us in the future? And then, but also remembering that there's a knowledge transfer that's not taking place. And so that education piece that Alejandro talked about is so critical. We got to keep on it, right? So, okay, James Delorme, where do you see yourself in the space? I'm in this space because my elders asked me to, and this is the Indigenous lens. I didn't choose it. It's what I am and what I became. So I'm an advocate. I'm a tech company. I do tech. I build things with tech, but also it's making sure our communities are safe. And at the end of the day, that level of trust and that safety for our communities is absolutely paramount. Nothing comes before that. Safety of our communities, no matter what. And individually, they need to be protected. Thank you.
I think I want to provide just a tool. I know that it's not very specific, but actually it can bring many ideas. I have been involved in several discussions, in several meetings about the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources at the WIPO level. WIPO is the World Intellectual Property Organization. So this is about Indigenous peoples across the globe coming together to actually bring the problems about protection. Now it's okay, we know that there is a problem, but how we're gonna provide that protection. So there are tons of documents in the website, and there are several actually courses that you can take around intellectual property. It's not that I'm a fan of intellectual property. I'm not defending intellectual property. I'm not an intellectual property lawyer at all. I hate intellectual property, but actually it provides a very good context. It provides a very good context, and I have seen several communities that can have benefit from this because there are already several legal tools that they can be used to protect different levels of traditional knowledge. And cultural expressions as well. So, and I think it's so important. And now, of course, with all social media, it's so important that actually, as I always say, the youth have more tools in order to protect the traditional knowledge.
Great, thank you for sharing that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I keep thinking about Creative Commons licenses, right? And like,
Yeah.
what does like an Indigenous version look like? Because none of the current licensing things. So
No.
yeah, so that's a whole other discussion. That's definitely outside the scope. I think we know there's probably some IP people who would love to jump in that. So
and just I saw a comment. No, totally. Traditional knowledge, to put it as property, there is a big issue. It's a big issue. Sadly, and this is one of the big things that is happening in the space, the only way to protect legally traditional knowledge is with intellectual property. And this is there is a contradiction. There is a contradiction, and I'm not supporting this system, but it's very difficult other way around. So yeah, I totally. We need to make a change in the system, but yeah, that will take way more time. Sorry,
Yeah.
Jeff.
No, that's great. So I think we're gonna wrap it up. I think we're almost half an hour over. We're gonna find a way to have you both back and Tia as well. Because it's been a fascinating conversation, super enlightening. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to spend time with both of you, and Natiea as well. I hope our other meeting is going well. And thanks everyone. We still had like over 70 people hang out here as we've gone over, so it's been great. For any questions, reach out by email. Everyone will share everyone's details. We're going to be this is recorded, so we will send it out if you need to share this with anyone, and we'll make sure that everyone has everyone's contact details. That's been part of this presentation that's spoken here. Once again, thank you for attending, for spending your time. It's super valuable. Really appreciate you and everything you've given us.